Welcome back to Insights, and today I want to look at globalism. I've been wanting to do this for quite some time, but I think now is that time. Across the screen right now you can see that there's a picture of Renee and I. We're at the University of Montana campus, actually in the center of the campus, an area they call the Oval, and way over to your left on this picture, you can see that there's a banner by some people walking there. Well, now coming across the screen is that banner up close. And this is in 2012 on the center of campus at the University of Montana. It says, building a university for the global century. It's globalism right in the middle of a campus. And I wouldn't say this is some trending, leading campus from Northeast. This is Montana. And yet here it was. You know, when we talk about globalism, we're talking about ultimately is a global government. We're talking about a global economy, which would be tied to a global banking system and all this kind of stuff. And yet, I want to pull back a bit because we can easily just run into the politics of this. And rather than focusing on that, the insight I have for today is that globalism, or the other view, which would be sovereign nations, meaning nations have their own ruler and their own governments, and they need to get along with other nations, but nobody's ruling over all of them. This whole topic is fundamentally biblical. So let's dial down from everything else and just look at this biblically. In Genesis chapter 10, we're right after the flood, and it gives this long genealogy. And at the end of the chapter, verse 32, it explains that all the nations of the earth came from these people that came from Noah off the ark. But it says that God separated these nations. It was his purpose, his goal to have separate nations. Interestingly, the very next chapter, Genesis 11, we see man in his rebellion doing the exact opposite, and we have the Tower of Babel situation. And so we try to get rid of the nations early on in the biblical account, do something that is actually contradictory to what God had created and purposed, and now we're in trouble again, and God confuses the languages. But let's fast forward all the way up to Acts chapter 17, verse 26, where Paul talks about that God put every nation in place. And it even says with their times and boundaries, meaning every border for every nation, God put it there. Globalism says, take down all those borders and let's just be one big global community. God says, I have purposes for each nation and I want them separate. But even more fascinating is we go to the last chapter in the Bible. So we've gone from Genesis 10, now we're all the way in the last chapter of the Bible, Revelation chapter 22. Now we're looking after Jesus' second coming, and Jesus says, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. God is not doing away with nations even after Jesus' second coming. So in other words, the millennial kingdom here on earth, there's still going to be nations, and you can even see that further supported in the major prophets, like in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. It explains even there that there are still nations. Now they're going to live in peace, but there are still nations. So all that to say this, we need to understand as believers, when this shows up on a college campus or on the news or wherever, we need to realize this is fundamentally biblical. And if we move in the direction of globalism, we are actually defying the purposes of the living God. So as believers in the 21st century, what do we do with this information today? I look forward to being with you next week when we'll talk about that very thing.